Hello everyone, and welcome to Brussels. Are you an entrepreneur considering an establishment in Europe? Do you want to know which stimuli are available in Brussels for your innovative company? My name is Alexandre Gangji. I'm a consultant specialized in innovation funding, and I will provide you with a short introduction to the general principles of incentives for research and innovation that a company needs to know when starting business operation in Brussels. Well, let us begin with why a US-based company would consider investing in Brussels and Belgium. To provide a little context to this question, it is worth noting that as a general objective at the European level, member states are encouraged to put 3% of their GDP towards R&D. This goal was established roughly 15 years ago, and if you look at 2019 figures, Belgium is at roughly 2.89%, which places it among the top 5 EU member states. The average for the bloc is 2.19, which means Belgium is performing over 30% of the EU average. While of course these are just numbers, it does paint a clear picture of how integrated R&D is in the Belgian economy and how this compares in relation to other members of the EU. Nevertheless, what really sets Belgium apart is the rate at which Belgium increased its share of GDP dedicated to R&D since the inception of this objective. Having raised this level from 2% to 2.8% since the time of the objective, the nation maintains the highest rate of R&D growth as a percentage of GDP of any country in the EU. This is due to the strong support from the federal government and regional governments in the form of tax incentives and R&D grant incentive to encourage companies to invest in R&D in Belgium. So how does this strength translate into something your company can leverage? It is likely best to split these incentives into two categories. On one side, there are tax incentives, and on the other side, there are grant incentives. While tax incentives are mostly at the national level, grant incentives are prevalent at the regional level. Starting with the national level tax incentives of interest to a foreign company investing in Belgium, these can be further subdivided into 4 main types. The first is a partial withholding tax for R&D, which applies to companies that are actually based in Belgium and Brussels, with evidently R&D profiles on their payroll. These companies can benefit from an exception of 80% of the withholding tax, meaning that for a worker who is 100% dedicated to R&D and for whom the employer advances roughly 30% of the withholding taxes on the employee's salary, 80% of these charges could be exempted. This is a massive incentive, and there are roughly 4,000 companies at present which claim such a withholding tax exemption. The second most important incentive is rather new and is the so-called innovation income deduction. This applies to companies that have revenues coming from innovation that is either patented or copyrighted, and allows for a deduction of 85% of their net revenues from their taxable base. What does this mean concretely? Very simply, if you were, for instance, a software company and you had revenue directly linked to the innovative software, taking into account transfer pricing, you would pay practically no corporate taxes in Belgium. This applies across industry. Thirdly, and quite succinctly, there is the investment deduction, which is a kind of pure R&D tax credit. This deduction allows for 25% of your R&D investment, if capitalized, to be deducted from your tax basis. The final tax incentives is also quite interesting for a foreign company. This is called the copyright tax regime. This mechanism allows you to allocate to your creative collaborators, being employees, freelancers, or managers, a specific indemnity for the transfer of their copyrights to the company, which benefits from a very advantageous tax regime. Up to 25% of the gross salary can be paid in copyrights, allowing to considerably increase the final net salary of your collaborators, and this for an equivalent employer cost. That sums it up for the fiscal incentives. If you would like to receive a general overview of taxation in Belgium, you can watch the video on corporate taxation in Brussels. As I mentioned earlier, there are also grant incentives linked to R&D. These grants can be applied in addition to, not in lieu of, the tax incentives mentioned earlier. These grants come from the Brussels capital region specifically, through an institution called Innovations. Innovations offers grants to companies engaged in R&D who decide to invest in the Brussels capital region. Looking at their figures from last year, they had grants of around 50 million euros and helped roughly 100 companies engaged in R&D, from small to medium enterprises to large companies investing in the Brussels capital region. These companies apply to the R&D grants with a proof of concept across all industries and is welcoming to companies coming from outside of Belgium. Lastly, Brussels, as the capital of the European Union, also sets up companies competitively to apply for EU-level incentives. Some such incentives relate to Horizon Europe, which is a 95 billion euro fund dedicated to research and innovation, where sustainability is at the core of the program. I would also like to mention the European Emission Trading Scheme Innovation Fund, the so-called ETS Innovation Fund, aiming to promote innovation reducing carbon emission. It is a program of 10 billion euro over 10 years. Finally, there is also Connecting Europe Facility, which is an interesting program focusing on energy, transport and digital, as well as the Digital Europe program. So, circling back to my introduction, Belgium and Brussels in particular are increasingly lucrative places to invest in R&D. Not only for these tax incentives and R&D grants, but also because of the local skill sets which can make or break a project. Many companies have chosen to invest in Belgium specifically because of the talent pool of very qualified researchers and employees at a competitive wage. This explains why the pharmaceutical industry and the life sciences, more broadly, who benefit immensely from the tax incentives and competitive workforce, have chosen to make Brussels and Belgium their European home. I believe the results speak for themselves, as Brussels stakes a claim as one of the most lucrative places to develop R&D projects in Europe. I hope this video has given you a clearer insight, and hopefully this triggers your interest in setting up your business in Brussels. We hope to see you soon.